So thank you all so much for tuning in to tonight's very special edition of the John Wright Speaker Series. We have with us tonight Dr. Doug Tallamy, the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture and Natural Resources in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He's an internationally recognized scholar and author, but we have the remarkable good fortune of caring for a river in the same mid-Atlantic region that gave rise to much of Dr. Tallamy's work. So many of the stories he tells will resonate with you because they describe some of the same plant and animal relationships those of us living around the Severn River watershed will recognize. We're going to hear a lot tonight about ecosystem services and food webs and biodiversity and wildlife, but I want you all to remember it's key that all of the practices Dr. Tallamy describes will also directly benefit the Severn River. So everybody who takes the advice given this evening will improve soil health and get more trees and native plants in the ground, which will infiltrate stormwater and be good for the Severn. Dr. Tallamy is not just a wealth of information and facts, he stitches them together with storylines that are approachable and compelling, and the more people take away from this work, the better off we'll all be. He's a prolific author, writing dozens of peer-reviewed articles and several books, including Bringing Nature Home, The Nature of Oaks, and the New York Times bestseller, Nature's Best Hope. I would ordinarily have held up the copy I keep in my office, but I gave it away last week to a young man who did some intern work with us, asking me what was the best thing he could do for the river. And I got up onto my soapbox about replacing lawn with native species and started to drone on a little bit. And I saw him glaze over. So I said, take this book, go home and read it this summer and you'll learn everything you need to know. And I certainly encourage everybody tuning in tonight to do the same. So we will drop a link in the chat for places that you can access Dr. Tallamy's work. Speaking of the chat feature, I do want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. Because we have a big turnout for this evening's talk, if you have questions, and I hope you do, please put them in the chat feature and we will get to them at the end. The meeting is being recorded, so if you have people that you think might be interested in this content that couldn't make it for whatever reason, then please do feel free to share the link once we get it up on the website. This is the opposite of Las Vegas rules, okay? What happens here should go forth everywhere as much as possible. And finally, if you value tonight's presentation and our work, please support the ability to deliver this sort of high quality educational content by becoming a member of Severn River Association. Any financial gift in the past year makes you a member. So please join us today and help us support a thriving Severn. So without any further ado, I would like to pass it off to Dr. Doug Tallamy. Welcome, Dr. Tallamy.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you. And thanks for the introduction. It's true. You might think what I'm talking about does not directly impact rivers, but it certainly does. It's plants that manage watersheds, and we're going to talk a lot about plants tonight. So I call this Nature's Best Hope. It's really, it's my idea of what Nature's Best Hope is. And I'll give you a spoiler, you're Nature's Best Hope. So I'm really going to tell you about why I think you're Nature's Best Hope. But before we do that, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of Nature's Best Hope was. The late E.O. Wilson, he died the day after Christmas 2 years ago. Terrible loss to the world of conservation. But one thing that was consistent throughout his very long career at Harvard was his love of life on Earth, his love of biodiversity, and his efforts to save it. And he wanted to save it not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save life. We're going to have to save nature, functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it will disappear everywhere. It was a very bold statement, and he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that is a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and everything that's in trouble could be in that half, will be in the other half, and everybody will be happy. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and I don't see that diminishing anytime soon. And we've got 8 billion people, and all of our airports and roadways and detritus in the other half. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? That's really what I want to talk about tonight. I do think we can, but we need a new approach to conservation to do that. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happened in 2019 on the East Coast, and then again this year throughout much of the country. We had a very large oak mast. Members, particularly of the red oak group, got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. But I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn, first it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. And after it's out of the acorn, it's a dangerous time for that insect larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. That takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly stays in that underground chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end. And they take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in it, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year the way most insects would? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, once they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she's filled it with 3 species of Temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they've left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move the colony. Grab the larvae, grab the eggs, move the entire colony into the new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. And then they post a guard there, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants, that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and they'll fly up to a mile, some people say 1.5 miles, from the parent tree. Then they tap it below the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. And a jay can plant 4,500 acorns every single fall. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Facilia. That is the only pollen, that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have between 3,600 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk all night, all week, all year about nature specialized relationships. The point I want to make tonight, though, is that actually most of these relationships, nature itself today is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the country as it was, particularly the lower 48 states. There's only about 5% of the country that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And those are largely mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We've grazed it. Got 770 million acres of rangeland out there. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And we've also paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves, and each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need. Because remember, it is nature that keeps us alive on this planet. Edward Wade Teal, decades ago, said we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. This is just common sense. So why have we done this? I don't know. But I suspect we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large, but we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. Now, the UN is predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years, and they actually made that prediction 2 years ago. So now it's the next 18 years, I guess. It's a prediction, has not come to pass yet, and we have to make sure it does not, because these are the species that keep us alive on this planet. It is serious business. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and as Shakespeare would say, upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talks about. This talks about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me. But those efforts to deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what would happen if insects disappeared from the planet, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants went extinct, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse. The amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And humans, of course, would not survive any of those drastic changes. There is good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do that we depend on every day, like produce oxygen, like clean our water, slow its journey to the sea, where it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants, of course, are building their tissues out of the carbon they take from carbon dioxide. They remove it from the atmosphere out of harm's way. And then they pump the extra carbon that they fix through photosynthesis into the ground through their root systems. And once it's in the ground, it's very stable, stay there for thousands of years. Plants build topsoil and hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather. They convert sunlight into food. If we were to lose our plants, we would have to eat sunlight and we would lose weight. What do animals do for plants? Lots of things, but these are important ones. They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people that are demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks, we do have preserves, they're doing the best they can, but it's not good enough. We are now in the 6th great extinction event the planet has ever experienced. So I think the solution is to start practicing conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like this. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the land than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another place, doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Otto Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic. And he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. We cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Otto Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture. He may not have recognized it as an option. So what I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, private property. Most of the land is privately owned. 78% of the lower 48 states is privately owned. 85.6% of the U.S. east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on properties like this, we're going to fail. And remember, failure is not an option. And when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it exactly the way I mean. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there. But every year there's less and less. So we need to go beyond conservation. We need to move into restoration. We have to rebuild the bits of nature that we've torn apart. And you will hear right away, well, there's no way you're going to put it back together again exactly the way it was. And they're probably right. We've changed too many things. But we can reunite enough of the specialized interactions I opened the talk with to create functional ecosystems again, even if it's not exactly what was on a particular piece of land at some point in the past. But all species don't contribute to ecosystems equally. So we have to start with the building blocks. We have to start with the most important groups. And there's two groups we can't do without. One is the flowering plants. And of course, the pollinators that allow them to reproduce. They're capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. So now we have the food that animals need locked up in plant tissues, mostly plant leaves. If we don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. If you don't have any animals, you don't have functional ecosystems. Well, most vertebrates, it turns out, don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any insect. Caterpillars turn out to be enormously important. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee that we have in this part of the world. I live in Southeast Pennsylvania, by the way. It's a chickadee that's at our feeder all winter long, eating seeds, and we tend to think that's what chickadees need. Well, 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seeds, but only 50%. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they switch to invertebrates, and if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars, and they are not alone. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they are soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper would be exoskeleton made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Beaks like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar. They are nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And many beetles have really sharp edges too. So you don't want to stuff something with sharp edges down the throat of your offspring. Then finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from, particularly during the breeding season? Well, from all those things they bring back to the nest, but look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars. Here are the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. And it turns out there's a direct relationship between how often a prey item is brought back to the nest and its carotenoid content. Turns out the caterpillars are brought back more often than anything else, and they have the highest carotenoid content, followed by orthopterids, things like crickets and grasshoppers and katydids. And then everybody else is nestled down here at the beginning of the chart. So those studies and others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? Or one or two a day enough? That's a good question. So let's go back to Carolina chickadee. There's a lot of data on Carolina chickadee. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? Well, one or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of Carolina chickadees to the point where they fledge, where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days, but they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count that. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make a nest of a bird that's a third of an ounce. This depends on the number of chicks in the nest, by the way. Third of an ounce, that's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do, because in so many places, that's all we have is our yards, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard, because chickadees only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not contain all of those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's a Smithsonian group who said we've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups, the species that require insects and the species that do not, and particularly during the breeding season. So things like doves and finches and crossbills can actually make a little milk out of the seeds that they eat, and they can rear their young on that. And look, that group, the species that do not require insects, didn't decline at all in the last 50 years. But the species that need insects decline on average 10 million individuals per species. And this doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take away bird food, you lose the birds. And it's not just little birds that need caterpillars. This is a kestrel eating a white-lined sphinx, and it's not just birds that need caterpillars. This is an ornate box turtle. They used to be common in the Midwest. They used to chase down armyworm and cutworm outbreaks and eat hundreds of caterpillars a day. So we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, be pretty. Now we ask them to do 2 things, be pretty and ecologically functional. And there's no way that's going to happen unless we put those caterpillars back. So how do you add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you add the plants that support those caterpillars. It's pretty straightforward. But there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we put in our yards, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. It's not an exception. It's just a good illustration. You can have all of the Bradford pear, the Callery pear, all of the privet, all the burning bush, all the ginkgos, all the hostas, all the camellias, all the things we typically landscape with in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That is called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why is that? Well, because plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And if you don't believe me, after the talk tonight, go out and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. It's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. But we do know that insects eat plants, so how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat the plants for which they have very specialized adaptations that allow them to circumvent those plant defenses. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations, life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of interacting with those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So if we take the milkweeds out of our yards and replace them with hostas, the monarch's not going to start to make a living on hostas. Can't do it. So it has two choices at that point: fly away and find milkweed someplace else, or starve to death. It turns out there's three kinds of plants out there. There's plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor in 84% of the counties in which it occurs is one of the oaks. Oaks contribute more energy to local food webs than any other plant genus by far. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a good ornamental plant. It's got good fall color. But nothing eats a ginkgo. It's just not adding any energy to the local food web. And a good example of a detractor would be Callery pear, Bradford pear. Not only does it not contribute energy to the local food web, but it escapes from our yards and biologically pollutes all the surrounding landscape. What it does is push out the native plants that do contribute and replaces it with a plant that doesn't. So that's, in effect, it's removing energy from local food webs. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. We cannot restore ecosystem function if we don't have functional food webs in those ecosystems. And we're not going to have functional food webs unless we choose the right plants. And I'm going to give you three examples of how well this works when we do choose the right plants, starting with my house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. I should say our house. My wife, Cindy, lives here too. This is where we moved in the year 2000 to a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. It was a very old farm, been farmed almost 300 years, but they gave up in the year 2000. Last thing they did was to mow it for hay. So very, very few plants there. And we wanted to restore this little ecosystem here, but we'd never done that before. So we really didn't know what we were doing. But one of the things I wanted to try was to add a plant to this landscape and see if the caterpillars that eat that plant would actually colonize it and come. And the first thing I tried was to see if I could attract the Canadian owlet to our property. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet before. It's a cute little thing. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow rue. That's their host plant. And we didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure it was here 300 years ago before they farmed it to death, but the meadow rue was long gone. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace and planted it. And it grew very nicely, but this was early on. And I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would appear out of nowhere and colonize my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for about 2 months after I planted it. Then I was walking by for another reason, and I looked over. They were covered with Canadian owlets. They'd found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. We've added 2 species to the property. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That beautiful moth actually has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a misnomer. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa, but I did know of a patch of Biden's in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last summer they took over my front yard. That's okay. Well, I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to come and colonize my patch of Bidens, but they did, and now we've got a good population of both of those. So we've added 4 species to the property. Could the hackberry emperor make a living at our house? I wanted to see, not just because it's a beautiful, most beautiful butterfly in the world, because it's not, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to be on our property. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I got a couple of hackberry trees. I planted them. I had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find my hackberry, but they did. And now we got a good population of them. We've added 6 species, and that's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of moths that specialize on goldenrod in the mid-Atlantic states. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear some people don't like it, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover. It makes valuable berries for the birds in the fall. And by valuable, I mean they are high in fat. Our migrating birds need sources of fat to fuel that migration. And our overwintering birds need sources of fat to get them through the winter. And those berries come from tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know when Virginia creeper is in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. Turns out that Virginia creeper is a superior pollinator plant. So remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, it's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent to make a living at our house just because it's such a cool-looking caterpillar. Looks like a stegosaurus. Well, it's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm. Of course, we didn't have any American elm. Lost that decades ago to the Dutch elm disease. But there are 2 big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. And every year they make a lot of seed. So the second year after we moved in, I gathered some seed up from the gutter and planted them. They germinate in 6 days, grow very quickly. Today, those trees are over 80 feet tall. And yes, they brought in the double-toothed prominent, another big success, American elm. Want to see if I get the evening primrose moth to make a living at our house because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, as its name suggests, it depends on evening primrose, and we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that. The moth did come, spends the day with the head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plants we put back, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local food web, you can enjoy it right away. And remember, that's a new goal for landscaping now. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or 2-foot barewood whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to call on the moths that make the caterpillars that run the food web at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange. This is Suzuki's Promolactis. Sorry, this is the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the 2-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakburn, the pink-striped oakburn, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of caterpillars have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that's just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to contribute to the local food web. It will do it immediately. Now, this is what our yard looks like, taken from pretty much the same place I took that first picture. These days, just to give you an idea, we put some of the plants back. Now, we're still working on it, but It's a hobby. You work at it over the years. My research has shown over those years that if you know the number of species of moths in your local food web, moths, not butterflies. Butterflies are bad tasting day flying moths. They really are. They come right out in the middle of the phylogeny of moths. And because they don't taste very good, they're not adding a lot of energy to the local food web. So if you know the number of species of moths that are adding that energy, you have a very good measure of the productivity of that food web and the stability of that food web. So I have been counting the moth species at my house, taking a picture of every moth that I have found for the last 7 years now. I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,268 species of moths that I photographed right here on our property. Now remember, we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 22.9 acres, unless it's 29.2 acres, million acres. But our property is one tiny sliver of Pennsylvania. Yet we have 48% of all the moths that occur in the entire state on this little piece of land. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why? Because we've got the bird food right there. So why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline that we see all the time. The World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. I like the way they phrase it. They've vanished. 2/3 of the wildlife has vanished, as if it's mysterious. In reality, we've killed 2/3 of the wildlife on the planet. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn this around. But will this work on smaller properties, let's say in suburbia? Very good question. So let's go to Margie and Ann Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in a development. Everybody around them has the big lawns. When they moved in, their yard was choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, another invasive from Asia. So they got rid of that. They planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard. And they are up to 154 bird species, including 35 warbler species. An amazing number. So compare that to our house. Now, I used to say we only recorded 8. I've got to fix this. We've recounted and more species are adding. So we're up to 18 species of warblers so far, but it's still, half of what they've gotten on 0.6 acres. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. Can it work in urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. Her property abuts O'Hare Airport. She has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural area at all. She's a tiny island in the middle of Chicago. It's a pretty island because Pam is a native plant landscaper and she knows what she's doing. So, by the way, if somebody says you cannot make a pretty landscape out of native plants, remember Pam's landscape here. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature. And then she sat back, she says, with a glass of wine, and started to count the birds that are using her yard. She's up to 125 bird species that have used her yard so far, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. All right, there's 4 things we need to talk about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And we need to succeed in a big way. And one of those things is to address those big lawns. If I had to pick one landscaping problem that we have that is affecting our watersheds, it is these big lawns. We have 44 million acres of lawn. Let me see if I've got that. Yeah, 44 million acres of lawn is the latest figure I saw nationwide. That's an area bigger than all of New England combined, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we do that? Well, it's a status symbol. And we love neat, and we have to display our Halloween decorations and our Christmas decorations. But what if we were to cut the area of lawn in half? Now, notice I'm not saying get rid of it. Turf grass is the perfect plant to walk on without killing it. It's a cue for care so that you can actually change your yard without getting thrown out of the neighborhood if you use lawn properly. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? What if we took spaces like this and turned them into this? I got this picture from Dan Getman, who lives in Missouri also. I've never met Dan, but he had this big lawn and he started to replant it. He's very proud of it, so he sent me this picture. Well, let's make the math simple. Let's say we've got 40 million acres of lawn. We're going to cut that in half. That'll give us 20 million acres that we can restore right at home, which is enough space to create a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. That'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? What do we get when we put some part of nature right where we live? We get the opportunity to interact with that part of nature at our own time, our own pace. All we have to do is go outside, or maybe even just look out the window. We can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, 375 million people there with you. That was the figure last year. So I know what you're really going to interact with. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike or government closure. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. And I think the alone part's really important, not mediated by somebody else. You're developing a unique relationship with Mother Nature, just you and nature. And this is particularly important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder. So we're trying. We get 30 kids, put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour, go to a natural area, and they walk around for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of the natural world in their yard, all they have to do is go outside alone and get to know it, become familiar with it, fall in love with it. Alone. When we hover over our kids as parents, we are sending the message that this is dangerous stuff. This is something you should be afraid of. That is a terrible message to send to the future stewards of our planet. If they're afraid to be a steward, if they don't know how to steward, if they don't love being a steward, they're going to be lousy stewards. We can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in a very modest patch of nature in Hawaii. A little piece of lawn with the hedge. But there are no lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt those lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard. You put it in an aquarium. You learn how to take care of that lizard, how to be a good steward of that piece of nature. And inevitably, you fall in love with that piece of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground, catching lizards in her best dress the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture not too long ago, so who knows? But I guarantee she's going to remember these interactions with nature the rest of her life. And I guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet because of them. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can. It is a real thing now. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on the map. So your location and the amount of your property you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to reduce part of the lawn. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. Doesn't matter how modest it is. And then your little piece of your county is going to light up with a firefly. And the object is to get the entire country to light up with fireflies. Our mission is very simple. We want to motivate millions of people, millions of property owners to regenerate biodiversity in the two ways you do that: by planting native plants and by removing the invasive species that don't support biodiversity. And in doing so, we're going to build a community culture that is sympathetic to the needs of conservation. There are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park. One is a significant increase in biodiversity. And what's happened at our house just tells me how resilient nature is. We went from a blank slate to a well-populated 10-acre woodlot at this point in a very short period of time. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody removed the invasive species just from their property, we'd be 78% done. We'd be 85% done east of the Mississippi. That's a real good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the worst plant for sequestering carbon. Worst plant for managing the watershed, by the way. So if we replace it with anything else, we are helping climate change. And we're going to start to build viable habitats outside of parks and preserves. Any bit of conservation we do outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of a park. There are really important sociological products as well. National awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature is not optional. It's not just there for our entertainment. It's essential, and it's essential for everybody, which means I think everybody owns the responsibility to sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge the existing conservation organizations, things like Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, land conservancies, lots of people doing good conservation on private property. We want to get them all recorded on the biodiversity maps so that we have a very good metric of how we're doing. You know, we got this 30 by 30 initiative. We're going to save 30% of the US by 2030. Not if we don't record conservation on private property. So the map will help us do that. Did I mention that it is free? We're not trying to pull people away from other organizations. So everybody, you can be a member of Audubon or National Wildlife Federation and still join Homegrown National Park. But we do want to get the important conservation you're doing on your property recorded on the map. So we're gonna shrink the lawn. What plants should we put in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch, and if you take it out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that support that house. They are essential. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. What's the best keystone plant? Well, I already mentioned oaks. They are in the mid-Atlantic states. They support 557 species of caterpillars. Let's compare that to tulip trees in the mid-Atlantic states. They support 21 species. It's a good tree, good native plant, but there are huge differences among our native plants in their support of biodiversity. Oaks support more than 950 species nationwide. Again, no other plant genus comes close to that. How do you find out what the best plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most important woody and herbaceous plant genera in your county will pop up. And this works great in all of the states of the Union except Maryland. There's a glitch in the data set in Maryland. We've hired a new person to work it out. But if you go on Native Plant Finder today, you might find that Maryland has a lot of blanks on there. Hang on there. We will get it fixed. So we are going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants and invite a lot of insects to our yard. And then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. Turns out light pollution is a major cause of insect declines. And these are all the ways that lights are killing our insects, particularly the moths that make those caterpillars that run the food web. So it seems like a disaster, but it's actually good news to me. We have got to turn around insect decline. The last figure I saw was we've lost 75% of the insects on the planet. Terrible, terrible figure. So we got to not just stop it, but turn that around. And if we can increase insect populations by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There are a lot of switches to flick, but there's a lot of us to flick those switches. Now, right away here, well, gee, I can't turn the light out over my barn or over my garage or over my front porch because the bad man will come. right, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you realize is the bad man does not come very often. And even easier is take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. You can go to the hardware store, get these very easily. Yellow wavelengths do not attract nocturnal insects. If we were to switch out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we used LEDs, we'd save millions of dollars as well. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to modify our lights. Then we're going to invite one of the mosquito foggers to come kill all of our insects. Booming business around the country. And they say, well, it's okay because what we're fogging is a natural organic product. And they're right. It is pyrethroids. It's made by chrysanthemums. So it's natural and organic, just like cyanide is natural and organic, just like ricin is natural and organic, just like nicotine. There's a lot of natural and organic things that sound really warm and fuzzy, but not so much. They also say it only kills mosquitoes, and that's downright incorrect. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with, including our beleaguered monarchs. This is the result of a mosquito fogging event in the Chesapeake Bay a few years ago. My friend happened to be there, and he picked up a handful of dead monarchs, but he said there were thousands on the ground. It was during a big migration event. Monarchs, by the way, this year in Mexico, second smallest population ever recorded. So they're on the ropes. They're on the ropes. And of course, it kills our pollinators too, the things we're trying to increase. The interesting thing, the ironic thing, is that mosquito fogging does not control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. It's too hard. You've got to kill 90% of them to get good control. These guys kill between 10 and 50%. So they're not even close to getting good control. So they got to keep coming back and killing your monarchs over and over again. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. And a good way that the homeowner can do is to get a bucket and fill it full of water and put a handful of straw or hay or maybe some dead leaves, some organic matter. Put it out in the sun for a couple of days, and it will build up the population of diatoms and algae. And that is what mosquito larvae eat. So it becomes an irresistible brew to any female mosquito in your yard. She will preferentially lay her eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you get a sheet of mosquito dunks. Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So it's targeted. It's cheap, $12 for a season's worth of control. And it works, particularly if everybody did it. And this works too. Get a fan, plug it in, put it on your back porch or your picnic table. You can enjoy your afternoon cocktail out there. Sit in the directed breeze, and the mosquitoes don't fly into the directed breeze. So you can enjoy your yard without killing anything. All right, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape, particularly under our trees, in a way that allows those all-important caterpillars to complete their development. What am I talking about? Well, this is just an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches. Then it emerges as an adult. Then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species grow as caterpillars on the tree, and then they drop from the tree and wiggle their way underneath the soil to pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact the area under the tree so that it is rock hard. Very difficult for the caterpillars to get underground. And that makes this an ecological trap. Look, these are oak trees here. They're attracting the moths that lay the eggs on these trees, and then the caterpillars develop and drop down and die. I'm convinced that the way we landscape or don't landscape under our trees is another major cause of insect declines around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. It's what most people do. If you got a tree in a yard, and I'm convinced that, well, actually, I'm not convinced because I got a grad student measuring this right now. Emma Jonas is measuring how well caterpillars do in a typical situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a tree and then a layered landscape. So the caterpillars fall down. This is soft landing. the ground is not compacted. It's turning out that's one of the major causes of insect declines is compact soil. Nobody's going to mow it. Nobody's going to step on it. Much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your fancy spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put big beds under your trees. The caterpillars will love it, and so will the trees. Use their native ground covers liberally, things like wild ginger. This is native pachysandra. There's Virginia creeper as a ground cover. Golden seal, May apples, foam flowers, fern. If you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants. Green mulch is the way to go. Again, the caterpillars will love it, and so will those trees. Former grad student Desiree Narango did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and her results suggest there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices. She had one simple question. How well do chickadees do in suburban yards? This is inside the beltway of DC. Suburban yards that were dominated by native plants versus yards dominated by typical introduced ornamentals. And when they're dominated by introduced ornamentals, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you reduce the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So everybody had a nest box up in their yard, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to reproduce. If they did try to reproduce, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings. And it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of woody plant biomass, non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. We looked at woody plant biomass because that is where chickadees forage, on woody plants. All right, this is replacement rate. This dotted line is replacement rate. That is the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. And that's what happens when you're above the line here. But if you make fewer babies than adults dying, and that's what happens over here when you have a lot of non-native plants, then you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. So right here is where those lines intersect, liberally speaking. So you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying your local food web. Now, we can't tolerate any invasive plants, no calorie pears, no burning bush, because they're just ecological tumors. But there are a lot of ornamentals that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? That's a ginkgo tree, ginkgo from Asia. Why does Dan have a ginkgo in his native planting? Well, it turns out that Dan's wife likes ginkgos, and Dan likes his wife. So we put in a ginkgo. The question is this tree wrecking the ecological integrity of this landscape? No, it's not. It's just there. Is it going to escape and become an invasive in the local woodlot? No, it's just there. So I like to think of plants that are just there, not contributing, but just hanging out there as if they're statues. So there you go. There's Dan's statue. If all of Dan's plants were statues, he would not have a viable landscape. But remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of those contributing native plants. If we increase the percentage of these, we can tolerate many of these. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken by a drone 400 feet up. You do not get more formal than that. And every plant in that landscape is a native plant. So this shows that formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. They love them over there. So if Europeans can love our native plants, maybe we can too. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbor that this is intentional. It's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. Could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? Well, the media will tell you we need them because they pollinate 1/3 of our crops. It's actually about 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. So where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. How about this? Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life here versus the amount of life here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program, it's several years old now, that's paying homeowners to reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very popular. Pennsylvania has instituted a similar program, not to help biodiversity, but to help the watershed. Unfortunately, it helps biodiversity too. Virginia's talking about a similar plan. I don't know if it's up or running yet, but more and more states are seeing the wisdom in this. There's an island off of Florida that is paying homeowners to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you actually use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on these invasive ornamentals like Callery pear. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did, Fayetteville, Arkansas, North Carolina, I think, has a bounty on them. You take out a Callery pear, you get a free tree replacement. San Antonio and other public utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water-efficient native plants instead of the thirsty non-natives. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in the far west, particularly California. This has gone up. You now get $3 rebate for every square foot of lawn that you replace with a xeric planting. California doesn't have one drop of water to waste on ornamental grass. And if you want more information on each one of those programs, memorize that. All right, I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one's important. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. It's not that we don't like it. We like nature. We like to go bird watching or ride our bikes or just take a walk, but it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-size poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save wildlife, save nature, so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. I want to save these beautiful places so that future generations can enjoy it. And I get that, because nature is enormously entertaining, but it is much more than that. We want to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist, and we talked about that. But if we restrict conservation just to the places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail, because those places are now too small, too isolated, and there's too few of them. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And this is what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance, and I don't like that language because it implies there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We have to put the plants back, not just to build biological corridors that will allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to recreate viable habitats in all those places where we've destroyed them. It's starting to happen. It is really starting to happen. And when it does, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody share the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good earth stewardship. It does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. More and more people recognize that planet Earth has some serious issues, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can use keystone plants, one person can modify their lights, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can remove their invasive plants, one person can fire Mosquito Joe, one person can do a whole bunch to revitalize the ecosystem on their property and then enhance their local ecosystem instead of continuing to degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it is obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They are all underfunded, all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so, it's going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own. So I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. And if you want to see those websites again, there they are. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tallamy. I'm sure that if we were in person, this would be the point of thunderous applause. But people clapping in their living rooms all over the watershed is probably not reaching your ears since everybody was muted. So
Okay.
really appreciate it. I do want to make sure that people have a chance to ask questions. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat and we will air those. But I'm going to take a host prerogative and ask one to get things started. I read or heard somewhere about how American chestnuts used to be one out of every 4 trees throughout the Appalachian Range, and before their blight hit them. And I wondered, I know that that was a long time ago, but I wondered if you were aware of any scholarship that describes the relationship between American chestnuts and insect species, and what that kind of looked like.
I'm aware of studies involving caterpillars. And it's hard because they did disappear before most people were recording caterpillars. But there's at least 7 species that went extinct along with those chestnuts. Now, chestnuts are not extinct, but they're functionally extinct. And those caterpillars are gone. One thing that saved a lot of species is the chestnuts are in the same family as oaks. So many of the caterpillars that use chestnuts could also use oaks and beeches. Which meant that when the chestnuts disappeared, a lot of the species did not. So that was good news. But yes, losing the chestnuts from Maine all the way down to Georgia was a tremendous hit on local ecosystem function.
Okay. And we have a question from Mary asking if you could repeat what goes into the bucket of water for mosquito control.
Some kind of organic matters, some leaves, maybe even grass clippings. I think if you read the box, it'll say straw or hay, but you don't have to go out and buy straw or hay. Just put in some organic matter. Imagine a mosquito in your yard. Where are they going to breed? They're going to breed wherever there's food for their offspring, and any kind of organic matter in water will generate algae and diatoms, and that's what the mosquito larva eats.
Thank you. Another question from Laura is what type of oak tree is best if you have moist soil?
Okay, it's a good question. Believe it or not, pin oaks, they're the oak of the swamp. We use them as street trees, but we shouldn't. They like bottomland. Swamp white oak is another good choice. So we've got 91 species of oaks in this country, and they occur on all different kinds of soil. They're all pretty much equally productive, but you do want to try to match the oak with the type of soil that you have. So if you have high rocky soil, chestnut oak is good, white oak is good. But yeah, pin oak and swamp white oak are good for the lower areas.
All right, thanks. Sean is asking if there's a compelling and socially practical nugget you can pass on to the people who scalp and chemicalize 3 acre lawn. I guess maybe the mow and blow set, the typical American landscaping approach. What do you think might be like the one thing you could say when you're greeting your neighbor at the mailbox in the morning, if it comes up?
Well, before I go into that, let me add water oak to that. As you move further south, water oak becomes more common, and it's a good one for wet areas. How do you change your neighbor's mind? I'll tell you what doesn't work, and that's meeting him at the mailbox and telling him he's living wrong and he should actually live like you. That's a very tough argument. This is why I give the talks. This is why I write the books. It's not a soundbite. It's hard to change somebody's perspective on what they're doing with a soundbite. So I try to lay out the whole logical argument. And when they get the whole logical argument, it's pretty hard to argue against. But there's so many reasons. There are 4 things. All right, if you want to give them a little elevator speech, there are 4 things every landscape needs to accomplish if we're going to survive much longer on this planet. Every landscape has to support pollinators. Every landscape has to support a food web. Every landscape has to manage the watershed. And every landscape has to sequester carbon. Lawn does none of those. And all that stuff they're putting on the lawn is actively polluting the local watershed. So ecologically, it's one of the worst things you can do. So if you can get that message across, maybe he'll listen, but do it gently. Don't, it's a sociological problem. It's not a scientific one. So
Maybe we'll get a sociologist for our next John Wright speaker series.
yeah, how do you change the culture? That's what it's all about.
We have another question from Robin asking, what would you say to people who get overwhelmed and don't know where to start their native plant journey?
I would say plant 1 tree, and I would say plant a small tree. I would say find an acorn in the fall and plant that. The acorns, the oaks on my property that are now 60, 70 feet tall, I started as acorns free. And so it didn't cost a bit, and they grow much faster than you think. They're slow the first couple of years while they're putting out a big root system, but then they take off. The only thing you have to do is picture them when they're bigger, so that you design your landscape appropriately, and protect them from the deer. You've got to have a cage around them when they're young, because the deer love oaks. But if you put that tree in and you put a bed around it, so if you had just picture a typical, I've got a slide of this, find it someplace, a typical landscape with 4 or 5 trees in it, and each one had a bed about the size of the shade under the drip line, that would reduce lawn by 30% right there. So without saying you're going to reduce the lawn, just say, hey, add this bed to your trees that are in your yard. You have reduced the lawn right there. And when you make a bed where the base of it is leaf litter, you're creating a sponge. I mean, talking about helping the watershed, you're removing something that creates stormwater runoff and creating a sponge that encourages infiltration. It's the perfect thing for river management.
All right, thank you. We have another question from John. Do you think it's possible for us to systematically eradicate things like English ivy and Japanese knotweed with the current treatment options available? Are certain invasives an inevitable fate?
Well, we have created huge problems with our invasive plants. I wouldn't think in terms of eradication. I would think more locally. You can eradicate it from your property. And there you've exercised your responsibility. If everybody did that, as I said, we'd be 78% done or 85% done in the East. A great first step. But getting them everywhere, particularly on public property, is a huge problem. But think of it. If we all remove the invasives from our property, we're also removing the seed rain that falls down on all the public properties every single year. Now, it will take a long time to get rid of that seed bank, but we can certainly reduce the frequency of these things in our landscapes. But I wouldn't think in terms of eradication. The logical first step is to stop selling them in our nurseries because that's insane. But we've created huge problems by selling them. They're now throughout our natural systems. About 30% of our natural areas are invasive plants from Asia. And the other huge problem that nobody talks about is the relationship between these plants and deer. We've got a serious overabundance of deer that won't touch those invasives, but they eat all our native plants. That is why you've got an understory of multiflora rose and autumn olive and calorie pear and privet and all the things the deer won't touch, but they eat all the native plants we want to be competitive. So controlling our deer, getting them back below the carrying capacity is part of invasive species management. Can we do it? Yes, we can. Do we have the social will to do it? Not yet.
I'm glad that you mentioned stopping selling these plants in species, and I'll just offer a shameless plug for Severn River Association. We worked hard on a bill this past legislative session that got that done in the state of Maryland. So as of October 1st, there will be a re-evaluation of a native species by the Department of Agriculture here that will prevent them from being sold once the department institutes regulations. So,
Good. Congratulations.
and yeah, thank you. And also, I'm dropping in the chat the link for folks that are interested in managing invasive species. That's one of our recurrent volunteer opportunities. So please do click on that if that's something that's interesting to you. So I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I think I'll say going once, going twice. And again, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, this is recorded. It will be on the website. So that list of references at the end of the presentation that Dr. Tallamy put up, you don't have to memorize it. You can come back and refer to it in your own good time. And Brian, yeah, what am I forgetting?
Yeah, I had a comment and a question. My comment is for folks that have HOAs or communities that spray for mosquitoes, which are a lot. You can go right down here for our local SRA folks, Department of Agriculture is on Truman Parkway, and you can do an opt-out form. So I'm a beekeeper, and the same office where I register my bees is the same office where I opt out of mosquito, and you get like a 300-foot buffer, which usually includes your neighbors. So the more of you all that do that, the more, the less. Yeah, I came out to like thousands of bees dead in front of my hive, and my mentor was like, "Do they spray in your community?" And I was like, "No idea," and looked into it, and sure enough, they did. So I dropped the form in there, and you can fill that out and opt out of mosquito spraying in your communities. My question was, I have some very industrious carpenter bees, and I'm wondering, Doug, is there a nice eco-friendly way to deter them or distract them in other areas?
Well, the best thing to do is give them nesting alternatives. They normally nest in dead logs and things, coarse woody debris, we call it. Hard to have that in suburbia, but if you can keep a snag or one on the ground, that at least gives them an alternative. Now, the season has started. If they're already in your porch, there's no way to get them out of your porch this season. But painting the wood slows them down. They don't like painted wood, and then giving them alternatives. They're important pollinators, so just wiping them all out is not a good option. But
I agree.
When would be the right time to paint? If this season is well underway, when do they go dormant, or would you not be hurting them to paint the wood?
Well, if they're in that wood, you're going to hurt them. It's to keep them from going back in the next year. But after they're not actively foraging after the first frost. So if we ever get frosts around here again.
And then Jesse, I was just going to add for general SRI folks that we're taking the summer off for the John Wright Speaker Series, but we will be back in September and October and November with speakers. And Jesse, you can tell them about September.
Yeah, so September, we're going to be joined by Adam Ortiz, who is EPA Region 3 Administrator. I believe that's September 16th, but I'm not sure where yet. So details forthcoming. We'll be putting that out in our newsletters and on social media for everybody who follows Seven River Association. You'll get the details as they emerge. And yes, Sean, we do have a mailing list. I'm going to drop my email in the chat and you can email me and I will get you on that list. So anyway, thanks again to Dr. Tallamy. Really informative presentation. We really appreciate you coming out and sharing your wisdom with us, and thank you and keep doing the great work.
All right. Well, thanks for the invitation. Good luck,
Absolutely.
everybody.
Thank you all for tuning in tonight. See you next time.